Hi guys, this is Nia and today I will be sharing with you my method of painting chicory flowers. This painting is quite easy so you can follow along to this even if you're fairly new to watercolors. I'm going to be painting a full page of flowers, but you can also try to create a minimal composition which would also look very delicate and pretty. So like usual, I'm going to be breaking down the method through drawing first, so hopefully the information is easier to digest. The form of this flower is very simple. The petals are thin with jagged tips, and all the flat petals gather and meet at the center. Sometimes there are also layers to the petals, so you might also want to add a bit of extra petals at the back, but this is optional. Once you're used to drawing the individual petals, if placing them in a circular position is a bit confusing, you can also try to draw out a circle first with a dot at the center, then try to direct each petal towards the dot. And to simplify the petals, you may also draw it out as regular leaf shapes so you have less things to worry about. And to paint it later, I'm actually going to interpret it by painting individual lines which comes together as petals, so it can be a bit more messy and expressive. And I'm also going to add some odd lines in certain areas. Going back to the simplified flower again, it's obviously the easiest to paint the petals facing straight on, but there are also ways of painting them angled differently. One way is by drawing out a very shallow bowl, which will help indicate the folds of the flower if you're going for a more detailed approach. This is a method that I always go to when I'm trying to visualize the folds, but because the flower itself is fairly flat, I'm just going to simplify it even more by only visualizing circles and ovals, except if the flowers are fully viewed from the side or the back, to which I would have to switch back to the bowl method because a bit more of the back of the petals are showing. So if you decide to use the circles and ovals as guides, you can also try to use a paper cutout of a circle with a dot in the middle and see when you tilt it and move it from side to side, the oval will become thinner as you view it from the side. And also take notice that the center point might also shift closer to you. And once you understand the ovals, then you can try to fill in the spaces roughly with petals. Don't worry too much about being neat because loose watercolor flowers are more about expressive strokes. The leaves of the flowers are actually very oddly shaped with uneven curves on either sides, but to paint this I'm going to take the liberty of again simplifying the shape to turn it into a very long basic leaf shape, but this time I'm going to create uneven sides by playing with the pressure and also wiggling my brush later when I paint. Moving on, I'm going to show you how these flowers grow. From the bit of research that I've done on the flowers, they're actually quite rigid. They grow branching out with one strong main stem in the middle, and instead of having a flower on the tip of each stem, several flowers actually grow out of the stem in almost a linear way, with the buds also forming around the sides. The stems are quite thick, but I'm going to turn them into thinner, more delicate stems as I paint. And the leaves usually grow in different sizes at the bottom part of the plant to finish everything off. Knowing this, I'm still going to opt to paint with my own interpretation, in which I'm going to only take certain elements but paint it as regular flowers with many delicate stems branching out. So instead of having one very strong main branch, I'm going to make smaller ones, and on top of that, I'm also going to branch out some of the flower buds as fillers. I'm also going to paint most of the leaves at the bottom, but I want to use some leaves also to fill in some spaces later to finish off the painting. These things I'm planning on doing will make the flowers itself look very different from the real thing, but you can also make your own interpretation using the elements that you have learnt here to create different types of compositions. And if you want something that is closer to the real thing, you can also do that. I'm just going to quickly go over the colors that I'll be using. I'm going to be using my Pentel watercolors for this, but of course you can use any palette that you have. So for the flowers, I'm going to be using Prussian blue and purple as the main colors, and for the flower buds, I'm actually going to mix red purple with some vermilion, but I forgot to put that down. The leaves, I'm going to use Viridian, yellow green, Prussian blue, and purple. And let me just show you how I'm going to be using these colors. So firstly, for the flowers, I use a very thin consistency of a mixture between Prussian blue and purple. And while the paint is still wet, ideally, I use a thicker consistency to paint the center. You can also change up the ratio, so some of the flowers are a little bit more blue and some are a little bit more purple for a bit of variation. For the flower buds, you can just use a thin consistency of the red purple if you would like to, but I find that this color is a little bit too glaring and bright compared to the subtle color of the flowers. So I'm actually going to mix in some vermilion to the red purple so it's not overly bright. And while the paint is still wet, I like to go straight to the bottom part of the buds, which is the green mixture that I'll be using for the stem. And I'm just going to show you how I mix the colors now. So for the stem, I want to use a fairly dark green color that is almost bluish so it works well with the flowers. And for that, I used a mixture of Viridian, Prussian blue, and also purple. And for the leaves, I'm actually going to use a lighter version of the same color, so I added yellow green into it. But if it's a bit too bright, you can just take some of the darker green for the stem before and mix a little bit of that so you have a more darker and muted green. You can also use the darker green as leaves if you would like to. I like to actually switch it up a bit, and especially for the lighter green color, I like to add the darker green where the leaf and the stem connect together to add a bit more detail. Okay, so now I'm going to start painting the flowers. I want to begin by having some of the lighter blue paints ready. So I'm going to mix in purple and Prussian blue together. And then I added a lot of water so I can get a very light consistency of the color. Sometimes I don't like to mix it too much, so some colors that I pick up with the brush might be a little bit more purple and some might be a bit more blue. I really like the variation that it gives because the color works really nicely together. So with the color, I'm going to paint the flowers using single strokes bunched together to depict each petal. You can paint a couple at once, but sometimes I also like to make individual flowers. When you're painting the flower petals, it's a good idea to keep some distance at the center. That way you have a bit of space to add the darker blue color. And while the paint is still fairly wet or damp, I like to let the darker blue mingle slightly so it creates a nice uncontrolled look that is special to watercolors. Before painting the other elements, I also like to draw out a bunch of flowers because I feel like the main composition are the positioning of the flowers. However, while painting the flowers, I also like to think about the branch slightly, and if I'm going to connect some of the flowers together or make them separate, while painting the flowers, I also like to play around with different variations of angles. This doesn't have to be completely extreme angles, but I like to tilt some of the front-facing flowers ever so slightly so it doesn't look flat. For the side-facing ones, sometimes I like to create two values for the flower petals, so it looks like some of the petals are peeking out from behind. And for this, you can choose if you want the petals at the back to be painted lighter or darker than the front. I choose to paint it lighter at the back, and for this one, I like to also paint the stem straight away since the bottom part of the flower is showing where it's connecting to the stem. I like to connect the dark blue mix with the dark green for the stem, and I'm just going to paint it very short because I can always continue on later to extend it if I need to. Since I already have a few flowers here, I'm now going to paint some of the stems, and I'm going to just show you how I mix the colors roughly. I use a fairly thick consistency of Viridian purple and Prussian blue mixed together until they almost look like black or a really dark bluish green on the palette. I wanted to make two tones with the lighter one that I mentioned before when I was going over the colors, so I also added some yellow green on the side just in case, but I didn't end up using it for this particular part of the painting. When I'm painting the stems, I want to make sure that my brush isn't overloaded with the paint, or else the stems might look a bit too thick due to the fast uncontrolled flow of paint. And to also create slightly textured and rigid stems for the flowers, I also like to draw the stems using short disconnected strokes. So it looks like the stems are sectioned out instead of it being completely flowy. And in those rigid areas, I like to add small markings made with tiny strokes as part of the flowers, which are starting to bud out, even if you can't see some of the flowers yet. And meanwhile, because this section of the flowers look quite empty in certain spots, I also like to fill it with a bit of some budding flowers using a thin consistency of red, purple, and vermilion together. So from here on, I just continued on with the rest of the flowers with those three elements for the time being to fill the page. If you're a bit intimidated by painting straight away on an empty piece of paper and confused at where to start, you can always draw out a rough composition on a scrap piece of paper first, just so you have an idea of where to start and use that as reference. I personally just want to have fun and relax with this one, so I just treat it as a doodle, and whenever I paint with that approach, I always try to paint most of the flowers first, then the stems, because the stems might get in the way of certain places where you might want to place the flowers. So I usually build a small composition with the flowers first, and if I were to paint the stems, I'd paint them quite short so I can always build more flowers around it. And if I want to ever extend the stems, I can always just add on to it. So before we get on to the final steps, I want to address a mistake that I made last week. If you didn't notice, I accidentally uploaded two videos at the same time. I usually schedule my videos, and when I was uploading a bunch at the same time, my YouTube page kept freezing for some reason, and it resulted in me having to re-upload some stuff. And when I was organizing the dates for the schedules, it seemed like it didn't save. It was bad on my part too, thinking that they were scheduled properly already, and I only checked on the intended video that I wanted to upload at that time, which is the sparkly seashore one, but I didn't check if the painting of my mimosa flowers were still scheduled on the same date. I'm not too sure what the system is, but from what I've heard, it's always been better to upload on separate days because your videos will end up competing with each other, so it won't perform as well. And I'm not even sure whether those videos would be recognized or pop up in the notifications for subscribers. So I'm very sorry if any of you missed it, but I'll link the videos at the end of this one, and I'll also leave it in the description box in case you want to check them out. So yeah, as you probably noticed then, this is actually an extra video that I just made, so I still have something to upload this week. So I'm very sorry for the confusion, and hopefully you guys didn't miss the videos, or if you did, hopefully you're willing to check it out. At this stage, I think I'm quite happy with the amount of flowers, so I'm going to go right ahead and fill in some places with a bunch of flower buds using a thin mixture of red, purple, and vermilion. I like to fill in empty spaces or if some parts are looking a bit too blue. And I also like to add some pink on the stems as well, just to break the long line if the pattern on the stem look a bit too repetitive. While the paint is still fairly damp, I like to continue on with the stem color so it has a really nice mixture between both the colors instead of it looking too stiff. However, if parts of the flower buds are drying, you can also reactivate the color using a bit of water so the color of the stem can connect to the flower buds again. And this goes for all of the flowers as well. And if the petals are dry already, but you still want to add the darker blue in the middle, you can also add some water to soften the edges so it blends nicely. Then to finish everything off, I'm going to paint the leaves. For the leaves, I like to use the lighter green color, which is the same color mix as the dark green, but with the addition of yellow green as I showed you before. And where the leaves are connected to the stems, I like to add some of the darker green so there's a nice transition between the two colors. However, from time to time, I like to either change up the ratio a bit or even paint with the darker green color from the stem and use a thinner consistency in order to introduce different harmonious tones. To paint the leaves, as I mentioned, I like to play with the pressure of my brush in order to create the uneven weight of the strokes, and I like to mostly place them at the bottom of the composition. However, if some areas at the top are still looking empty, even with the addition of flower buds, I like to also add a couple of little leaves here and there. But I still want the bush to be mostly made out of flowers, so I'm going to paint the leaves sparingly. And that's basically it. This is the completed painting. Remember that you can also create simpler and smaller compositions if you would like to, but I just find it really fun and relaxing to repeat painting the flowers. Anyway, I hope you guys enjoyed this one and learned something new, and if you haven't checked out last week's videos, I'll link them at the end and also in the description box along with my social media links if you're interested. Thank you so much for watching till the end, and I'll see you at the next one. Bye!